Okay, I'm going to demonstrate the procedures for testing a pressure vacuum breaker. So I'm going to be using the USC 10th edition procedures. So I'm going to notify, identify, inspect, and observe. So I'm going to observe that this is my pressure vacuum breaker. It says PVB on it, so I know for sure it's a pressure vacuum breaker. I've got a direction of flow arrow that tells me that my flow is up and out. So I've got shut-off valve number 1, test cock number 1, test cock number 2, and shut-off valve number 2. So I'm going to remove the canopy, and I'm going to flush my test cock. So I'm going to flush test cock number 1, and I'm going to flush test cock number 2. Okay. I'm going to put my compensating valve on test cock number 1. So I'm going to put my compensating valve arrangement up to test cock number 1. And I'm going to hook my high side hose to make sure everything's tight. Hook my hose up to test cock number 2. I'm going to make sure all my other valves are off. I'm going to open up test cock number 2, which will drive my gauge up to the upper end. I'm going to purge my gauge to make sure there isn't any air in the gauge or the hose line. Okay, I'm going to close shut-off valve number 2. And on a pressure vacuum breaker, you test the air inlet valve opening point first. Air inlet opening has to be 1 psi or greater. So I'm going to elevate my test kit to the level of the air inlet opening, which is this level. Okay, I'm going to close shut-off valve number 1 and isolate, and I'm going to test. Now the way I'm going to test the air inlet valve is I'm going to open up my high bleed valve slowly. Okay, so I'm going to open up my high bleed valve slowly, and I'm going to put my finger on the air inlet valve so that I can feel it when it opens. Now, you don't want to be in too big a hurry because this can happen rather quickly, so you may want to just tweak your needle valve so that you're just barely moving. And it's hard for me to see from this angle. Okay, so and I can't read the gauge from the monitor, but you can see how the gauge is going down. And I've got my finger on the air inlet valve. So what I want to do is I want to watch the gauge and feel for when the air inlet valve opens. If you're trying to watch the air inlet valve and the gauge at the same time, that's not always so easy. So I've got my finger on the air inlet, I'm watching the gauge. It's still going down slowly. Okay, my air inlet opened at 2.8 psid. Alright, now before I do anything else, I'm going to close my high side bleed valve. I'm going to remove the hose. I'm going to set my test equipment down, and I'm going to observe that the air inlet valve is fully open. So when I look inside here, the water's below the air inlet valve, and I can tell that it's fully open. I can see space between it. So I would report or record that the air inlet valve is fully open. Okay, in which case I'm going to close test cock number 2. I'm going to repressurize the assembly. These things are messy, so if you turn it on quickly, it doesn't make as much as a mess as if you turned it on slowly. So I'm going to hook my hose up to my compensating valve. I'm going to open test cock number 1, pressurize my gauge. I'm going to purge my gauge by opening up my high bleed valve. Again, making sure I don't have any air or in the line. So I've purged my gauge. So what I'm going to test next is the value of the check valve. So I'm going to elevate the test kit to the proper height. Well, the check valve's down here, or at least the water will drain out of the assembly to this point. So that's the low point that water will drain out. So I need to have my test kit a little bit lower than what I did before. So I'm going to isolate, and I'm going to test the check valve by opening up test cock number 2. And remember, when you're doing testing check valves, the water has to stop flowing and the gauge has to stabilize. So this can kind of be a little bit of an exercise in patience. You might have noticed that the air inlet valve popped open. It's supposed to do that. It's, you know, it seems a little bit funky, but it happens. Key thing is I'm watching the water flowing out of test cock number 2. When it stops flowing and the gauge stabilizes, then I can take a reading for the check valve and the pressure vacuum breaker. Again, patience. Alright, so now water has stopped flowing out of the assembly. My gauge is stabilized at 1.8 PSID. It's above the minimum of 1, so my check valve has passed at 1.8 PSID. Okay, I can set my test kit down. I can close my test cocks. So I'm going to close test cock number 2. Close test cock number 1. I am going to open up shutoff valve number 1. Open up shutoff valve number 2 slowly to get my customer back in service. I'm going to remove my test equipment. I'm going to make sure that I put the canopy back on. Alright, I'm going to fill out my test report legibly, accurately, and completely. And that completes the test for the pressure vacuum breaker assembly.